Thank you all for being here. It's great to be here. I think I've been here at all four of these, and it's always an honor and a privilege, and I always learn a lot by sharing the program with so many colleagues who I admire and respect. So I'm going to talk about education and educational opportunity, particularly with respect to race and ethnicity in America over the last 25 years. And I'm going to sort of show you charts that describe opportunity by using standardized test scores. And I want to make clear a few things up front. First, standardized test scores are certainly not the only outcome we care about with respect to education. As a parent or an educator, we don't think of the end of education as having children with high test scores. We want them to be happy and creative and collaborative and engaged and curious and innovative and empathetic. And we'd like them to know a little math, I guess, along the way, right? But I still think that the standardized test scores, sort of writ large, serve as a useful proxy measure of kind of the quality of educational opportunity that children are getting in America, and the differences in the amount of educational opportunity children are getting in America. So I don't want to reify the test scores, but I still think they serve as a sort of useful measure of opportunity. I also think it's important to remember that children's educational outcomes, whether that's grades or test scores or graduation rates or whatnot, aren't solely the result of things that happen in schools or that schools are responsible for. That is, educational outcomes are, I think, the result of the sum total of educational opportunities that children have had from the time they're born or even prenatally until the time we measure those outcomes. So that includes opportunities they have in early childhood, in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in their childcare and preschool settings, and in their K-12 schools. So the trends that we're going to see in terms of educational outcomes, don't think of those as referenda or measures of the quality of schools per se. They're the measures of the quality of all the kinds of educational opportunities that we as a society provide children, some of which obviously are due to schooling, but much of which the evidence suggests is also due to things outside of schooling. All right, with that as a preamble, I don't know how to, there we go. I first want to show you what the trends in racial and ethnic achievement gaps in the United States look like over the last 25 years. So the best way of looking at this is to look at data from NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, sometimes called the nation's report card. NAEP gives standardized tests in math and reading to about 800,000 children a year, every other year since the early 1990s. It does that in 4th and 8th grade. It does it in math and reading. And so that lets us get a good estimate of the average math and reading skills by race over the last 25 years or so. And what this figure shows you is the trends in the achievement gaps between Black and white students and Hispanic and white students. The white-black gaps are in blue and the Hispanic-white gaps in red. The gaps are measured here in standard deviation units, and if which is a thing only a statistician can love. So what is a standard deviation unit? Think of it as about 3 grade levels. One standard deviation corresponds to about 3 grade levels of difference in test scores. So the Black-white and the Hispanic-white achievement gaps are quite large. In the early 1990s, the math gaps for white-black gaps were over 1 standard deviation. The reading gaps were about 0.8 or 0.9 standard deviation. So that's on the order of 2.5 to 3.5 grade levels of difference in average performance. But the good news is those gaps have been declining for the last 20 years or so, both for white-black gaps and Hispanic-white gaps in 4th grade and in 8th grade. They've declined by about 15 to 25% over the last 25 years. Now, that's good news, but it still would take more than 50 years for those gaps to go to 0 if they continue at the same rate. So they're still quite large. They're still about 2 to 2.5 grade levels in terms of magnitude. So still a huge difference in the average achievement. But the trend is in the right direction. So why is the trend going in the right direction? Well, certainly one possible explanation might be that white student scores are going down, and black students, Hispanic student scores are sort of staying flat. And so we're making a lot of progress by cutting down the tall poppies, as someone recently described it to me. So that wouldn't be so great. And happily, that's not what's been happening. If we just look at average test scores by race over the last 25 years, test scores have gone up for every racial and ethnic group in the United States, in some cases quite dramatically over the last 25 years. They've just gone up faster for black and Hispanic students than they have for white students. And those differences are quite large. So if you look at for example, the math fourth grade scores, the achievement gap in 1990, this is about 3 grade level difference between whites and blacks. Black students today have higher test scores than the average white student did in fourth grade math a generation ago. That is to say, those test scores have gone up the equivalent of more than 2 grade levels for black students, closer to 3 grade levels, in fact, over that time period. They've also gone up for Hispanics and whites a lot, but they've gone up faster for black and Hispanic students in both math and reading than they have for white students. So that, to my mind, is the ideal scenario for how you want to narrow an achievement gap. Improvement for everyone, but faster improvement for those at the bottom. So why has that been happening? What's been going on? Well, one thing to notice is that the gaps have not narrowed faster at 8th grade than they have at 4th grade, and are not particularly smaller or larger at 8th grade than 4th grade, if you go back to this picture. What that says is that none of the action in the narrowing gaps is happening between 4th and 8th grade. All of the action in narrowing the gaps is happening before 4th grade. And in fact, in some other data we've looked at, when we look at test scores of children, school readiness scores when they enter kindergarten, suggests that most of the action in narrowing the gaps over this time period is because black students and Hispanic students are coming to school with higher school readiness relative to what they used to have and relative to whites than they used to. That is, almost all of the improvement in the racial educational gap seems to be due to changes in opportunities kids have before they get to kindergarten. There doesn't seem to be much change in the sort of post-kindergarten years. Maybe a little bit, but not a lot. So the action is largely not in the schooling years, but in the preschooling years. We hypothesize that much of that might be related to improved preschool and childcare opportunities. There's been a big expansion of preschool over time. The last point I want to make is a different one, and that is what in general drives these achievement gaps? Well, there's 2 big factors. One is white and black students and white and Hispanic students come from families with very different socioeconomic backgrounds. As a result, they can afford to live in different kinds of neighborhoods and have lots of different kinds of opportunities. So this shows the white-black difference in socioeconomic status, that is differences in income, education, occupation, and so on, between whites and blacks. 0 means whites and blacks have the same average socioeconomic condition. Each of these dots is a school district in the United States. And the vertical axis, again, is an achievement gap. You can see there's this strong relationship between the achievement gap and the amount of socioeconomic disparity between whites and blacks. Importantly, though, even in the few communities in the United States where there's no disparity in socioeconomic condition between whites and blacks, there's still a large achievement gap, about 1/3 of a standard deviation, about a grade level standard deviation. That suggests more than socioeconomic differences drive the achievement gap. This pattern is basically the same for the white-Hispanic gap. The other thing to notice is that the largest gaps, some school districts have gaps that are 1.5 standard deviation. That's about 4.5 grade levels difference. So places like Atlanta, Washington, D.C. have enormous achievement gaps and enormous disparities in the socioeconomic conditions of folks. So if it's not socioeconomic conditions, what else is going on? Well, the other big culprit is racial segregation. So here we have a measure of the amount of segregation in a school district. This is a measure of the extent to which black children go to schools with much higher poverty rates than white children. So 0 means white and black children go to schools in that district that have the same poverty rates. 0.5 would mean black students on average go to schools in that district with poverty rates 50 percentage points higher than white students. So these are very segregated places by race and income. And segregation is highly predictive of the achievement gap. In fact, by itself, segregation is the strongest predictor we have of achievement gaps. And in every model we run, this remains a strong predictor. So that suggests we're not going to be able to eliminate achievement gaps without both reducing segregation, but the key way to reduce segregation is by improving the socioeconomic disparities between white, black, and Hispanic families so that they can afford to live in the same kinds of neighborhoods, afford the same kinds of schooling opportunities. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.